Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Mistress of the Damned. I am your Mistress Katrina. If you are new to the channel, hello. This is where I read through the enormous library of books you see behind me, which is always growing because I find new books that I want to read. And so I just buy them instead of reading through the books I already have, because that's what hoarders do. Last week we explored the horrors of the Holocaust in Ordinary Men. This week we're going to explore the other extreme of the spectrum, which is communism and socialism, and what happens when that devastation is brought to bear. Why? Because, the Holocaust was depressing enough, but for some reason nobody knows why socialism is not taught as much as Nazism is. We know it's not taught as much because nobody knows about just how bad Maoist China was. Everybody knows that Nazism sucks. Even Nazis know that Nazis suck. They just, wish that think that if Hitler had gone a little bit further, a little bit faster, nobody would be around to tell them how badly they suck. But then we've got socialism, where it's the dirty secret of the intellectual elites. They don't like to talk about just how bad it is because they, for some reason, genuinely believe that if they were in charge, things would turn out differently. We have literally a century of documentation saying it doesn't matter who's in charge, it turns out badly, but they seem to think that they could do it right. The ideal was awful from the moment Karl Marx shot it out from betwixt his butt cheeks, where he surely had his head shoved when he thought of the idea. This is how bad and devastating socialism is. And yet it remains revered by intellectuals with college degrees, because only someone highly educated could be so irredeemably stupid. So let's go. This week's book is Mao's Great Famine. Turn so you guys can see it, by Frank Dikötter. The history of China's most devastating catastrophe between 1958 and 1962. So that's 4 years. I think we determined last week that the World War II was 6 years. Mao's Great Famine was only 4 years and was 3 times as deadly. 3 times as deadly. That is how bad socialism is. Let's jump into this. All right. Let's start by what makes this book such an excellent resource for anyone looking to study the after effects of socialist policy is the incredible scope of primary sources that Dikötter drew on. He has extensive interviews with survivors, and he was able to obtain access to government archives that were open in a limited capacity to researchers. Again, only if they had a recommendation to be able to access it. He points out, as Dikötter points out, this is a single-party state. China still is a single-party state. So the archives do not belong to the people. All right, here we have the Freedom of Information Act in the United States. You can file a FOIA request and get access to just about anything. Not everything. There are some things that are still deemed off limits, but you can file a FOIA request and at least ask the question. You can't do that in China. It's a single-party state. They don't allow that. But Dikötter got access to it, and he interviewed these primary sources. Now, he didn't interview them directly. He specially trained interviewers to go out and collect these interviews on his behalf. He did that on purpose. He wanted the survivors to be able to speak in their own words to somebody who would understand their language. So his interviewers were drawn from the various regions of China so that they would speak the same dialect and there would be no miscommunication or misinterpretation. The people being interviewed could just speak their minds and tell their stories. And it's devastating to read. Okay, so the Great Leap Forward was Mao's tippy-toe through socialism, trying to force collectivization and eventual communism. And it was a catastrophic failure by any metric. When China started in 1958, it had a population of some 600 million. Conservative estimates have 30 million dead of starvation, disease, brutality, murder, all as a result of socialism. Dang it. Maybe I should stay away from books about democide and governments and what governments will do to their own people, because the horror is just awful. It's just overwhelming. Okay. So when Mao started all of this, he was fully aware that industrially, China was way behind the rest of the world. They were still, by and large, farming communities. But he intended to leap start industrialization to get ahead of Great Britain in the same time that Russia was saying they were going to get ahead of the United States. All of this through communism and collectivization. That was the grand plan. Before any of that could take place, Mao had to purge the ranks of the party from anyone who was not ideologically pure, which means anybody who was even just a smidge to the right. If you didn't agree with Mao 100% in lockstep of what he wanted to do, you were purged from the party. And those top-down purges went down all the way to the very bottom, and it led to some genuine monsters being in charge at the local levels. The next step to collectivizing the people in rural areas, was collectivizing the people in rural areas. The farmers and peoples in small villages reacted when they were told that they were going to basically lose everything and everything was going to be sent to the cities because this is what was good for the country. They basically slaughtered their own livestock and family pets because they figured if somebody was going to eat it, it might as well be them. It was their food, right? Their sheep, their cows, their dogs, their cats. This is not a commentary on whether or not dogs and cats are considered normal food in Asia and parts of China. This is what happened. All right, they saw the writing on the wall and they reacted as anybody would. Basically, fuck it. If I can't have it, I'll burn it to the ground. And so they did. Farmers were then pulled off their farms, so the people who actually knew how to farm were pulled from the farms to go and build dams and irrigation where none was needed. This incidentally led to mass salinization of the farmlands. Basically, they salted the earth trying to build dams because the water rose to the point that it was leaching salt out of the salt and other minerals out of the earth around it, salting the earth so that nothing could grow. Tool maintenance went out the window. Basically, by the end of the first year, the farmers were digging their furrows by hand because all the tools belonged to the state. Why would they bother maintaining tools that didn't belong to them? That becomes somebody else's problem. This is the tragedy of the commons, which is an economic theory that has been played out again and again throughout history. If something belongs to everybody, then nobody is responsible for maintaining it, and it goes to dust. Rather than talking to the farmers who had been growing food on their land for generation, the inner circle, the people in charge of enforcing everything, decided that farmers should be close cropping and deep plowing. So close cropping is where you plant the crops very, very close together. Now, this is not the same as companion gardening. Companion gardening is a tried and tested means of planting, wherein you take two plants that have basically nothing to do to each other, and you plant them close together. They each pull different nutrients from the soils, and everything grows beautifully. You'll see this a lot with the Three Sisters. I believe it's a Native American concept of companion gardening where you grow corn, squash, and beans close together because each of those three things requires different things from the soil, different nutrients from the soil, and they're able to grow quite well. Close cropping is where you basically just plant everything really close together, so all of the rice, all of the wheat, everything was planted right on top of each other so that nothing could really grow because they were in competition for the nutrients in the soil. That did not work well. Plants died. You would get the grossly incompetent cadre leaders who would think that because something was growing really well, but now we needed to grow something else, so they would rip out perfectly good plants that actually were growing to plant a different crop that did not grow as well. Famine was endemic. People were starving to death inside of 6 months. 6 months out of a 4-year voyage, so buckle up, it gets bumpier. They also decided that they should try deep plowing. Normally, when you're plowing the earth, you plow to a depth of about 7 inches. Everything he put is in centimeters, so I had to kind of do some conversions here. So you plow to about 7-8 inches is a normal furrow length or furrow depth. Deep plowing, they decided, is where you plow to about 20 inches. Remember, they didn't have any tools left. Tools weren't theirs, and what tools they did have were not maintained by them. They were maintained by the state, so maintenance was basically non-existent, which means they were digging to this depth by hand. All of this was with the idea to improve soil water retention, which is not needed in a country where water is already pretty near the surface, which is a prerequisite for planting rice. And it was just as catastrophic as it sounds. Nothing grew. The plows, what there was left, because Mao wanted to catch up to and pass England in industrialization, he decided that all metal in the country should be melted down into steel so that it could be used for creating machinery and other industrialization projects. But that's not what happened. They lit these forges that they were required to be manned, and so people would be set on them to man them 24 hours a day, and they melted down all of their plows, all of their farming implements. Everything that would have made it easier on them was destroyed to basically make pig iron. Nothing that would have been a grade good enough to create steel. Just the entire countryside was destroyed in favor of this great leap forward that never happened. Coupled with the massive failure in crops, Mao Zedong went on a massive international shopping spree. He promised the crops that did exist as payment for these manufacturing equipment to be imported in so that China could start manufacturing. So the crops out in the country that normally the farmers would grow for themselves and then sell whatever excess they had, thus kind of make sure everybody survived, were stripped from the countryside and shipped to the cities so that the people could eat, and any excess from there was shipped out as payment, so the people in the country starved. People started flocking to the cities, but there was no work in the cities because the cities were grossly overpopulated. So at the start, they had all this excess food which was shipped in from the country, and Mao said, oh yes, everybody eat up, eat 5-6 times a day, and it led to profligate waste. In the cities, people were throwing rice out in the street, and the rats feasted, while the people in the country starved to death because there was no food for them to eat. It had all been shipped to the cities. You might think that Mao Zedong was not responsible because the numbers were faked. Right, the cadres out in the country would tell him, oh yes, we have these huge crops coming in, and they would grossly overestimate the crops that came in. But Mao didn't want to know. He truly didn't. We know he didn't want to know because very early on, when the famine was just beginning, several party leaders stepped forward and indicated that this might not be what was happening, that all was not as it seems. They were denounced as rightists and purged from the party. So again, anybody who disagreed with the chairman was booted from the party. If it did not support him, that meant that he was wrong, and Mao could not be seen to be wrong. It was not politically correct to tell Chairman Mao what he did not want to hear. The cadres who oversaw the labor were vicious. They were incredibly vicious. They beat those who were unable to work, or beat those who were caught trying to steal food so that they could keep going. And there was no leniency for children who were caught stealing. The children were, they might be anywhere from beaten to drowned for attempting to steal food to eat. The book is filled with memories of people beaten to death for not meeting quotas, families killing each other because of tempers fraying due to lack of food. The people in the cities, in the end, were not much better because all this manufacturing was very, very cheap. Labor was cheap. So industrial accidents were really frequent. Turns out the Labor Party didn't care about the laborers. They cared about meeting the quotas that had been handed down to them. And because of the people flooding the cities, labor was very, very cheap, and death from accident was a very common way to go in the cities. Especially hard hit, he actually dedicated an entire section to the 3 hardest hit classes, which would be children, women, and the elderly. Socialism sees everyone as the same. That sounds like a good idea. It sounds like utopia, right? Men, women, we're all equal. We're all capable of doing the exact same thing. So it turns out we're not. All right. It's not politically correct to say so, but remember, it's not politically correct to tell Chairman Mao what he doesn't want to hear. There were no adjustment made for quota based on age or gender. So there's a story of a 13-year-old girl who was told to move a 100-pound sack of earth. She's 13 years old. I'm not sure if I could lift 100 pounds right now. All right, and I'm a very well-fed, overfed Westerner. Not sure I could lift 100 pounds. This was a girl who had been starved for a long period of time, being told to move 100 pounds. And when she couldn't do it, she was beaten. If you were unable to deliver your quota, food was withheld, and so you continued to starve until you died. And that was normal under socialism. While theoretically there were kindergartens for the very young children, they were not the happy places we think of here in the West. There were no alphabets on the wall to teach them how to read, and there were no toys for them to play with, and there was no story time, no nap time, no milk. They were basically holding pens where they were just kept in squalor. The food allotments that had been set aside for the kindergartens were often stolen by the caretakers of the children because they were starving too. And it's really easy to sit back in horror and be like, oh, how dare they steal from children, but they were starving too. It's not like they had much else to go on. They needed to eat too, and they couldn't because the food wasn't there, because the chairman kept sending it to the cities to be shipped out to pay for his industrialization projects. Sometimes the mothers, knowing that they were unable to take care of their children, would take their children out and abandon them to nature, thinking that maybe their kids would be able to find food on their own. The elderly were abandoned. The villages emptied out. Excuse me. Damn it. Okay. Alright, the elderly were abandoned. The villages emptied out, trying to get to the cities, leaving the elderly to care for themselves. This is socialism. This is what Chairman Mao did to his people. And this is what people are trying to do to America. So bear that in mind. Next time somebody tells you we don't want socialism, we want democratic socialism, there is no difference. The difference is socialism was forced on China. We're dumb enough to vote it in. Don't be that stupid. The knowledge is out there. Find it. Okay. Women, in addition to being forced to abandon their children or even sell their children because they needed money to buy their own food, were raped and abused by the cadres a lot. Sometimes they were made to work naked just because. If they didn't, they wouldn't get a food quota for the day, so they could work naked or they could starve. Many turned to prostitution, many more killed themselves. You could die of famine, disease, brutality, or accident. Ultimately, the death toll of Mao's Great Leap Forward has a conservative estimate of 30 million dead on the low end, 55 million on the high. Frank Dikötter puts the number at about 45 million. The low end is estimated by professional statisticians. The high end is a number arrived at by an independent researcher, Yu Zhihuang, who Dikötter credits as being very smart and savvy. Dikötter settled his own number at 45 million because ultimately this is the number that was reported by a Chinese expatriate, Chen Yizi, which is a number he cited as being reported at internal meetings of senior party members under party leader Zhao Ziyang following the Great Leap Forward. So 45 million was the accepted number by the party leaders. That's murderous. Again, this is what happens when governments turn against their people. I know that there are overeducated and uneducated who say that wasn't real socialism. That wasn't real socialism. I don't want that socialism. I want democratic socialism. Again, the only difference is under democratic socialism, you vote these assholes in. But you can't get them out once they're there. Because once they're there, they're in charge and they make the rules that are for the good of us all. Socialism is a philosophy that ruins everything it touches. It's been tried in Russia, China, Cambodia, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. Lots of books on the Holocaust. There are a lot more books on the failures of socialism. None of those books are ever taught in colleges to the people who are now trying to tell us that we're wrong for hating socialism. Only the Holocaust is taught in the West. It's almost like the intellectuals running things don't want us to know just how bad it can get. Read Mao's Great Famine by Frank Dikötter to find out just how bad it can get in one example of socialism. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, click the subscribe button. Follow up with the notification bell to actually be told when new videos post. So far, I'm posting on Mondays around 9 a.m. I'll post a link to Frank Dikotter's website. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next week.